Hello, everybody, and welcome back to I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin, coming to you still live on Spotify, as it turns out. I know we considered a protest, but nobody was willing to offer us $100 million for any program. If anybody wants to offer us
Yes.
$10 and a sandwich, I think we'll go exclusive to whatever platform you want.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I actually, funnily enough, I don't remember why, but I was looking into just like in the potential future, how to go about monetizing a podcast if that was a route Mike and I wanted to take. We haven't even really talked about that amongst ourselves, really.
It hasn't really been something that we need
No,
to
it hasn't
talk
really
about,
been an
but-
issue. But I saw it for, I think like an opening ad. It was like, so most ad companies do things in, it's called CPM, which is like basically how much money they give you per 1,000 interactions, more or less. And the highest one that I could possibly find was $25 per 1,000 downloads. And I was like, oh, cool. So that would work out to roughly $1 an episode based on like our current listenership.
Which, like, hey, look, I could take $1, but at some point, if that's all I'm making, I'll
Right.
maintain the integrity of the podcast.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm not, just to be clear, I don't think Gavin or I are against selling out. Like, I'm happy to sell out.
It depends
but
what it is.
I want to make sure that I'm selling up for the right purposes, and until then, this little quarter of the internet is going to stay completely ad free.
Yeah, absolutely. And so getting into a little more of the meat of the episode, Mike actually hit me with a bit of an update, or that at least that he has an update. He hasn't told me what it is yet to one of his Mike Takes the Wheel episodes. So Mike, what do you got?
So journeying back to our original Mike Takes the Wheel episode, do you remember who we discussed?
Was that the Governor Morris?
Yeah, it was
episode?
Governor Morris. That was my favorite founding father. And I'm currently reading a book on Governor Morris. And
Cool.
I'm a notoriously slow and notoriously weak reader, but I need to provide a little bit of an update.
Okay.
And this hurts me a little bit because we talked about in that episode how Governor Morris spoke against slavery at the Constitutional Convention, and he was firmly opposed to it. I don't remember if I dropped the word abolitionist on him, but it was something I thought of him as something they're just radically anti-slavery,
right? Yeah,
for a founding, which is good. And as I was reading this biography of Governor Morris, in the early 1800s, when France had bought Louisiana from Spain, kind of the Louisiana Territory, and Governor Morris got very worried that the French being there, and I forget the exact circumstances, we're going to provoke all the slaves and have them rise up, and we can't have slave rising up. They need to be kept down, kept in a position of subjugation. And so,
oh, that's a bummer.
Yeah, I need to provide a clarification to everybody that Governor Morris, not quite as cool as I thought, and I'm doing some reevaluation of who my favorite founding father is. So,
yeah, I mean, we talked about this a couple episodes ago, where it's like maybe even last episode, to be honest. Basically, that it's okay to think certain people or certain things that certain people have done are cool and good. You just have to take the good with the bad,
Right, exactly. And part of what was so fun about Governor Morris to me was, he seemed to have like this radical, modern position. It's, banal by today's standards that slavery is bad, but like at the time, he wasn't just, I don't like slavery, but we'll, make do. He was, firmly like, this is a bad idea. And yeah, just reading that, I was like, oh man, like we had to go down that path. So I just wanted to provide that update and clarification on episode 19 that I have here.
Yeah. Well, it's even still like, at least I was taught in, my history classes in high school that like, Lincoln freed the slaves, which like he did, obviously. Well,
do we need to have an episode on that?
I mean, maybe, but I did not learn until well after I'd gotten out of high school that like, yes, he, signed the Emancipation Proclamation and such, but he by no means thought that black people were his equal. By no means.
The Emancipation Proclamation is quite possibly the most overhyped document in American history for what it did compared to what it was said to have done.
Right, yeah.
But we will maybe
a topic for another day. Yeah,
that's a topic for another day. But we will leave that alone now. But I just wanted to provide that update for everybody that as we learn new things, we will update our prior episodes. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so with that, apparently, so in addition to me learning something, there's some apparently there was some big news in the paleontology world. So Gavin, why don't you hit us with that?
Yeah, and sadly, it's not good news. Um,
Man,
so
just
there is,
we're real downers today.
yeah, that's why I was really hoping your thing would be positive. So there is a very famous fossil track site in Utah called the Mill Canyon Fossil Trackway. And so it is an early Cretaceous trackway from around 110-ish million years ago, and extremely famous. It's in the general Moab area of Utah, which I talked about in our national parks episode. Because when I
Hmm.
went to Utah, that is where I stayed. There are several national parks in that area, and like a lot of the western United States, that area just in general has a lot of federal land. And so most federal land is under the jurisdiction of the organization, the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM.
I was just about to say hashtag BLM.
Yep. And so this track site is included in that. But most BLM lands you would not recognize as federally owned as if you were just driving by it. But this particular site, because it is so important, has all sorts of uh, interpretive stuff. There's like a boardwalk so people don't walk on the tracks because that damages them. There's all sorts of art and good information stuff that it has been put up there by the federal government for people because that's public land. Anybody can go there and check out this really amazing fossil trackway that's like hundreds of feet long, one of the best trackways in the world.
So this seems like a good thing. The fact that there's lots of
Yeah.
this is publicly accessible. All right, so hit me with the bad news.
So, I think I started seeing it yesterday. I don't know when it actually happened, but I started seeing things circle around on Twitter yesterday. So that would be Monday of this week. That a bulldozer or backhoe or some kind of not giant but large construction equipment had driven over the trackways
On purpose?
on purpose.
Ah,
And so you hear things every now and then about people spray painting over things or scratching things out, which like that happens. As crappy as that is, that happens, and there's really not a great way to police that.
mm-hmm.
But this was a very flagrant violation of federal law. Somebody here broke federal laws with like a signature. Because so what happened was that boardwalk needed some repairs. Because like I said, there's a boardwalk that goes through the site to make sure that people don't walk on the tracks. The boardwalk needed some repairs. And so instead of just, taking a hammer or a screwdriver or drill or whatever and just removing those boards and putting in new ones, they just decided to take away the entire boardwalk using a backhoe on these tracks.
Who's they? Like, who's the they in this circumstance?
So I don't know the person's name. I will link somebody's Twitter account who I did some of the art that is at the site to like teach people about the site.
Mm-hmm.
So a artist that was commissioned by the federal government to depict this site, who has been very outspoken on Twitter and sharing really good information. They actually had so there's a field office for the BLM in Moab, and they had like I think it was a pre-scheduled thing, like a Zoom thing today, that just so happened to be kind of taken over by this because this happened so recently and very vocally. People, it's still an open access site. People can still go there, and people saw this backhoe just sitting on the tracks. So it's like there's pictures and video evidence that this is, to my knowledge, still currently sitting on the tracks.
Just like anybody want to contact like the authorities or something if they're breaking federal law here, like this?
Oh, they did.
I mean,
And so from what I've seen, I wasn't able to go to the Zoom conference thing, but I have followed closely some people that were, and people were like, hey, what are you going to do about this? Because, most federal forms are public information. And so people looked up, what the hell is this? Because to get a backhoe there, A, it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere. You don't just end up with a backhoe there on accident.
Right, you're not like, whoops, I made a wrong left. Like
Right.
like
Somebody
this
got a
has to be
green light for
intentional.
this. Yeah, somebody
Yeah.
got a green light for this to do this work. And like there's literally just one. We've talked about it before, but there is a single federal paleontology law. Just the one that is very clear. If you are doing work on federal lands where fossils are present, you need a paleontologist there. That's literally the field that I work in. That's why
I was gonna
I'm
say that's
recording this
literally your
out of a
job.
hotel. That's why I'm recording this out of a hotel in the desert right now. And so that's why I'm like, this is my particular corner of paleontology because this is the field that I work in. And it's like the people who come to watch us get mad at us if we are not watching the machines closely enough, let alone the machine operators and the construction company if they don't even have us there. So it's like, the people who greenlit this should have known that there needed to be paleontologists there. And the construction companies, maybe not the machine operator themselves, they're not always, up on certain laws, and they kind of just see us as annoying things that get in their way anyway. But the people in charge, the project manager for whoever, because it wasn't like it was like a person who works for the BLM in the backhoe, it was a construction company. The person who sent that person and that machine there knew that there needs to be paleontologists there. So there are at least two people who very clearly knowingly broke federal law. And to my knowledge, this is one of the first times that this has been like very publicly done, where it's like, we know whose signature is on that document. You greenlit this. And these tracks are destroyed because of you. And to be fair, I want to say that the most significant tracks were not destroyed, and the entire track site has been 3D scanned and is digitally available, which is really good, but there's no substitute for having the tracks themselves.
Right, like, good, fine, but
right. Go ahead.
Is there a moral to this? Is there a thing you want to leave us with, or is this just like bad news that you needed to get out? Like this just seems like there is nothing good to come out of this other than like follow the law and don't do this again.
I will try and do a follow-up at some point whenever something potentially happens, but like several people should be fired because of this. Several people should be fined heavily because of this. Some people might even probably should go to jail because of this. And maybe this is me being a little biased. I don't remember exactly the penalties laid out in the law itself, but certainly monetary fines, as well as the people involved at the BLM need to be fired. Because this is completely unacceptable.
At some point when your job gets screwed up so badly, at some point, someone's got to pay for that. And,
exactly.
I take no pleasure in people losing their jobs, but
no,
at some point, things have to be done.
No. So as of right now, there is no really good news. So we will link, like I said, that person who did the art, who's been very outspoken, their Twitter account where they've been posting updates and stuff down below. If you want to learn more about it, check it out. Apparently, and this quite surprised me, Utah's governor got involved and seems to be actually quite helpful.
Really?
Yeah.
Who is Utah's governor?
The name was familiar, but I don't remember who it is right now.
Well, I'm gonna look it up right now.
But yeah, apparently I've read a couple statements that he has put out, and he's saying the right things. What?
Ready, Gavin? Ready?
I'm remembering his last name now. Yeah.
The governor of Utah. His name is Spencer Cox. Cox.
Yep. Yeah. But anyway, he seems to be saying and doing all the right things, so hopefully that continues. Although, I mean, there's a bit of a thing with
Spencer Cox.
Oh my! But yeah, there's a little bit of like state stuff stepping on the toes of federal stuff. Gets a little complicated, but
yeah, it always does. But
yeah, this is something that needs to get solved and now, because like I said, to my knowledge, there's never been like a significant test of this law before, where it's like we very clearly know who did this. So now we just have to see what happens, because apparently during that Zoom thing, the BLM people that were there were very much doing politic answers, where they were like, the BLM Moab field office is committed to preserving fossils, yada yada yada. And it's like, well, clearly you're not.
Yeah,
And it's
right.
like, well,
Like,
and people,
prove it.
and people ask, they're like, what about the backhoe that is literally still there on the tracks? What are
I have
you
photographic
doing?
evidence that's
There,
alive.
there are pictures. What are you doing about it? And where people and the BLM people were just kind of like, we're concerned. I'm like, well,
I mean,
thoughts
like
and
I have
prayers,
sympathy. Yeah, I
you
mean, I
know?
have sympathy for if there's a developing situation, people giving non answers until everything's given checks. But like that means you need to go like through those processes, do your
Yeah,
thing, and then give real answers pretty damn quick.
yeah.
So
So
hopefully,
yeah,
hopefully that's a situation that gets solved soon, and we can have a more positive update later on, or at least a less negative update. And I'm sure
yeah,
Gavin will keep us up to date on any potential happenings with that.
yes, absolutely.
Um, we
Anyway,
are reasonably deep into this episode, and we haven't actually gotten to the topic yet. So motion to skip today in history, and to just get right into the topic. What do you say?
seconded.
All right, let's do it.
So today might actually be a little bit lighter of an episode, just because a new video game dropped on Friday, and I spent most of the weekend playing it.
What was the video game?
So it is a new Pokemon game.
There it is.
Uh,
Say no more. Okay.
well, okay, but it's a very different Pokemon game. It's basically what if Monster Hunter, but Pokemon. It's like an open world ish Pokemon game, not like regular Pokemon games. If you like Monster Hunter, play it. It's really good.
Understood.
Um, anywho, but this episode was requested not by a listener, but by Mike in episode 56 about manatees. I mentioned that manatees have nails on their flippers, and you were like, "Can we do an episode about claws or something?" And I was like, "We sure can." And here it is.
I didn't remember this at first, but now I'm thinking like, yeah, just like that. The whole idea of claws and nails, and like
Mm-hmm.
it's a kind of a real niche thing. Why? How did that happen? So yeah, I am looking forward as I think part of what I'm thinking as that happened, because you mentioned nails, like where do fingernails come from? Why is it that my fingers and toes aren't just like skin all the way around? Because when you think about it, it seems weird that we have nails. But I don't know if you're going to cover that at any point today, but just that whole idea of things at the end of fingers is a cool, interesting thing to me at least. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah. And so when I talk about claws, what I'm talking about in this particular episode is claws in tetrapods. So that does not include things like crab pincers, even though people would call them claws. Um, a lot of arthropods, like insects, spiders, things, they have like little hooks at the end of their legs to hook onto things that resemble claws. Not talking about those today. We're talking strictly tetrapods. That would be vertebrates, things like you and me, that have four legs, or at least used to. Um, and so, even some fish probably technically, just because fish are so diverse and wacky, I'm sure there is like a fish that probably has some form of claw on their fins. We're not talking about them. We're only talking things with legs here.
Understood.
So, what is a claw? And so this is sort of the first episode I think we've done where I talk about a particular piece of anatomy instead of like a group of animals or a time period.
I think you might be right about that.
So when I talk about this piece of anatomy, let's break it down a little bit. So most people, like, you see it in your head. You probably statistically have a cat or a dog that lives in your house. You've presumably been scratched by their claws at some point. Um, Most people are pretty familiar with that, but let's talk about the actual anatomy of that little thing that, you know, sticks into your clothing sometimes.
All right, let's do it.
So most people have heard the word phalanges, right?
That's just like fingers.
Yes. So
Okay.
phalanges is the name of the bones in your fingers and toes, not like the bones in your palm or like the main part of your foot, just the bones in your fingers and toes.
Cool.
So that is the plural. The singular is phalanx. Not sure. It's a Greek thing, I'm sure. Not sure why that's the singular and the plural. Not going to question it. So when I say phalanx, just know I'm talking about a single bone, and specifically the end bone in each of your fingers and toes is called the ungual bone.
So the ungule is one of the phalanges.
Yes, it is the
Okay.
distal most phalange or phalanx. So even I kind of fall into it sometimes. So
I forgive you.
distal meaning farthest away from the body. So for example, your hand is more distal than your forearm.
Okay.
So that is the only bone that can be like a true claw. Um, so claws are made out of the bone on the inside and then keratin around the outside. Keratin being the protein that makes up your most of your skin. That's why your skin is thick and why we can't breathe through our skin like frogs can. It makes up your hair and makes up your nails and or claws. And so a claw, like I said, is the ungule, the last bone, sort of wrapped in that keratin layer. That's basically all a claw is. And so we get a little bit deeper into there's different layers of anatomy. There's the outside layer, which is a little bit harder, still made of keratin, but called the unguis. And that is weird. So the two different layers grow differently than each other. So the unguis grows perpendicular to growth, which is why you get hangnails going off like at the same way your nail grows instead of the opposite direction. So if you ever had a hangnail, I feel like that's a pretty universal human experience.
Yeah.
Why it sticks out like that instead of across your finger, if that makes sense, because that's the way the unguis grows.
Right.
The inner layer, which is softer, is called the subunguis. Very creative, we scientists are. And that grows the opposite direction, so it grows parallel to the growth direction. And the bed of cells that both of these grow out of is called the nail matrix.
Oh, that's a cool name.
Yeah, although I was a little confused why it wasn't called the claw matrix, since the vast majority of animals that have this have claws and not nails. And like most things, it's because we named it after ourselves. Because we have nails. And I'll get a little bit into what a claw versus a nail is in a little bit.
Okay, I'm looking forward to that one.
And so the reason why claws or even your nails to a slight extent are mostly curved is that's the way the bone underneath is shaped, but also the unguis, the top harder layer, grows faster than the under layer. So it just naturally curls because the top is coming out faster than the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So that is just in general a claw. The distalmost bone in your finger or toe wrapped in keratin.
I mean, that seems like it makes a lot of sense. Like,
Yeah, it's pretty much what you would think.
Right. It's a bone that humans have. It's just with ours, it is wrapped in skin and not exposed. But
Right.
it could just as easily be exposed.
So claws, from a paper that I read, claws were, quote, ubiquitous among amniotes.
And what's an amniote again for anyone that might not remember?
You mean you? Yeah. So amniotes.
I do such a good job of playing the dumb guy in this podcast because I learn a lot better from listening. As I'm doing the podcast, it's hard for me to retain some information. Yes,
yeah, so, for sure.
So enlighten us on amniotes.
So amniotes are the group of vertebrates that basically includes reptiles, including birds, and mammals. So it does not include frogs, salamanders, or fish. Things that lay an egg that can live on land, or at least used to in the case of mammals.
Can lay an egg and live on land. Okay.
So if you think of pretty much any amniote, they have a form of claw. Some have lost it, like the one species of manatee that doesn't have claws or nails. Their front flippers don't have any form of nail, and they don't even have back legs anymore, so they functionally don't have any nails. To my knowledge, cetaceans, which would be your dolphins and whales, don't have any nail structure on their fins. Of course, they don't have back legs either. So, with a couple of exceptions, even though both of those exceptions used to have claws, but have since lost them. but pretty much any amniote you're going to find has claws or nails of some sort.
And so why? I assume there's a common ancestor involved here, or is this convergent evolution? Is this what's the rationale behind that?
Yeah, you hit the nail
The
right on the
history, I
head there.
guess.
So
Okay.
if something is so widespread within a group, we just kind of assume that it must be ancestral just because the odds of mammals and birds and reptiles all evolving it separately and it being so widespread among all of those groups is just really unlikely.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, amniotes likely have claws because they were ancestral. Their non amniote ancestors probably had them as well. And so then you sort of get to okay, well, what were the first things then with claws? And surprisingly, this is not something that is like super well studied from what I could find.
Hmm.
Because there's I compare claws to teeth a couple times in the rest of this like layout, and like that's true in some ways, but very not true in others. Uh, and the way it's not true is that teeth fossilize real well,
Right.
and claws do not. So we
So
do.
I was going to ask that question in just a second. Like, why not? Why don't? Okay. All right. Tell me.
So a keratin generally just flat out does not fossilize well.
Hmm. Okay.
Sometimes you can get impressions of it, like with feathers or skin, like scales. Um, but it's the reason why if you go to any natural history museum and you see a rhino skeleton, why there's no horn with it.
Okay.
Even really, really hardened condensed keratin, like a rhino's horn, does not fossilize well. It breaks down really easily, which you can tell if you've ever had like split ends in your hair. It's just keratin's just not a stable compound for all that long. It's really good at doing what we use it for, but if it just sits around and gets exposed to the sun for too long or anything like that, it just kind of falls apart.
So it's not built to
Um,
last.
right. That being said, there's two parts to a claw. The bone part is important too. Um, However, even that bone fossilizes a lot less readily than teeth for a couple reasons. One, teeth are made out of a much harder material. Enamel is much, much harder than bone and therefore fossilizes well. And with claws, yeah, you have 5 of them on each limb. So you have 20 total. That's less teeth than you even have in your mouth right now, let alone your baby teeth. So just statistically, there are more teeth in a given body, and humans even have reduced their teeth. Like we're missing at least 2 teeth
Mm-hmm.
compared to some other mammals, let alone reptiles. Reptiles just spit out teeth like they're nothing. Um, so I compare them to teeth, like I said, a couple times throughout the rest of this, but they don't fossilize nearly as well. And I think that's a big part of why it's not studied as well, because if we get like a skull of something that tells us a huge amount about it, doesn't really tell us anything about what their limbs were doing. So
Yeah. So I mean, that makes skulls don't tell you anything about limbs. That seems to make logical sense.
right, and it's like even for me, like as a mammal paleontologist, like we're basically told teeth are the gold standard. If you get a tooth, you can pretty much tell pretty much to the species if you know what you're doing. From a single tooth you can get a species. um, Claws are not nearly that diagnostic. You can't get like a single claw. Like I had several in the collection that I worked on for my thesis, horse unguals, so like the single toe bone that they have. I have no idea what horse that is. There's no way to tell really. If you have just the toe bone, you can't. I can tell it's a horse. That's about it. So for a couple of reasons, they're unlike teeth, but I will make that comparison a couple times. Um,
Okay.
but because they're not studied as much as, say, teeth, we don't know that much, at least that I was able to find. Big caveat there. That I was able to find about their evolution and how they became so ubiquitous amongst amniotes, like that paper said. So the best that I could find was looking at certain groups that are not amniotes but are close and seeing
Okay.
whether they had claws or not.
So what are some examples?
So there's a group that is the closest relative of modern amphibians. So amphibians being frogs, salamanders, and I always forget the third group. There is a third group, and I always forget them.
I hope you're not looking
Amphibians?
at me
No.
to help you out on this one.
Nope, nope. Uh,
Mhm.
anyway,
Okay.
they're not super important. Like there's a handful of species of them, but like you would recognize it if you saw it. Oh,
You get the point.
Cecilians, that's the name. They basically
Okay.
look like worms, but they're
Sure.
amphibians. So it is the closest relative of a group of that group. So the group of those three is called Lysamphibia. The next closest group to them are called the Temna Spondyls, who essentially look like salamanders doing their best impression of a crocodile, more or less. Very, very popular around the time that fish made the transition onto land. And
Hmm.
so they're not super closely related to amniotes, but some of them seem to have had claws. So to
And how can we
me,
tell that? How do we
uh,
know that they seem to have had claws?
just by looking at the structure of the unguals that we do have from them.
Okay.
So for example, we know that frogs and salamanders today do not have claws, with one exception that we'll talk about later. Um, so by looking at sort of the ends of their fingers and toes and comparing them to these fossil ones, we can tell, okay, they don't look similar. So they clearly weren't doing similar things. And you can also tell from like muscle scarring and different things like that, different wear patterns on the bones themselves, if they're well preserved enough, whether there was keratin on it. The same way you can tell from like a cow horn, or a cow skull, that yeah, there's a bone part in the middle, but you can tell just from blood vessels and things in the bone that there was a keratin horn there. Similar thing.
Okay. So we're inferring based on outside information. Okay.
Right. And so from the best we can tell, some of them had claws, but not all of them. And our closest, and by our I'm meaning amniote, non-amniote relatives, which is a group called the Diadectomorphs, may or may not have had claws.
May or may not. Okay.
It really depended. Some of them, it was well. So one was based on like a trackway, sort of topical. Um, that it was like, oh, we think that these tracks could have been made by a diadectomorph, or it could have been made by something that is an amniote. We just know that it had claws
Okay.
based on the tracks, and it's like, well, okay, that doesn't really help me in this particular situation.
Yeah. Right.
That was not the point of the paper. Trying to figure out whether this thing had claws. That was not the point of the paper. But that's what I was trying to use it for. Um, and so, unfortunately, I don't have a great answer other than the first amniote had claws.
Okay.
And I have a little note in here that just says stupid primates. Because if you just Google evolution of claws, every single thing that will come up is about primates. I'm like, that doesn't help me.
Yeah.
Because primates are very well known for having nails
Right.
instead of claws, which again, I keep mentioning that. I will circle back to that. Promise. Um, but claws in general. So that's basically, like I said, all that I kind of was able to push together about the evolution of claws themselves.
So we
I'm
don't have a
I'm
whole lot of hard facts on this. We can infer based on a couple of different things, including the fact that they're just so ubiquitous that there's a common ancestor that exists that
yeah,
had claws. But
right.
beyond that, we just don't know much. Is that about right?
Right. And so my first thought when I actually learned that Temna Spondyls, the group that's related to amphibians, um, had claws, was like, oh, okay, so claws must go back that far, and then amphibians, the modern ones, lost them. That was my first thought. After looking into it, there was no evidence to support that.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like claws evolved at least twice
Oh, wow.
in amniotes and in Temna Spondyls separately. So I don't know, and I don't think anybody has a solid answer for me on that. So, um,
If you're out there,
yeah, absolutely.
there's research to be done.
There sure is. And so that's kind of it for the evolution section that I wanted to cover. But I'll talk about some of the function, because this, for the rest of this, is going to be basically a functional morphology lecture, which is why things are shaped the way they are to do the job that they do.
Okay.
And so now getting to the teeth comparison, claws are a lot like teeth in that they're really useful for suggesting behaviors. What you're doing with your claws says a lot about how you are living your life. And in general, something that makes sense after it was pointed out to me, but I didn't really, I did not have it pointed out to me until grad school. But so in general, the forelimbs, so it would be the arms in us, are for doing things in your environment. That would be catching your food. That would be manipulating things in your environment, but more than just moving around. Whereas the hind legs are more or less just for moving around. You use them for other stuff, but their main function is locomotion.
Okay.
And because of that, front claws, because the front limbs are more adaptable, you're doing more varied things with them. There's a reason why, the hind limbs of cats and dogs generally look kind of similar, whereas their front limbs do not look very similar at all. If you're using them for more different things, you can specialize them more for what you're doing. And so also along with that, the front claws are generally more creative than the hind claws.
What do you mean by creative?
Basically doing more different things. So for example, of a cat, again, presumably most people know what cat claws are like. So the front claws of a cat are much more retractable. If
Right.
they're in their hidden position, you don't even see them. But whereas the hind claws, they're usually sticking out a bit to help with locomotion of the cat. And they're usually duller. They're much more dull than the front claws of the cat because the cat is using the front claws to grab onto prey. Presumably, that's typically what they should be used for before we brought them into our houses and let them sleep on our keyboards. And so that's sort of what I mean by that, where it's like the front claws are generally more specialized to do something besides walking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay.
And also, just a quick PSA that I want to throw in here: do not declaw your cats, please.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how, claws are just basically like the first,
Yeah,
the first, or I guess the last bone in your finger. Like, correct me
yeah.
if I'm wrong, that's just like removing part of your fingers would be the equivalent.
Yep. When you declaw your cat, they literally rip off the last bone in each of their toes.
Oh, like I'm squirming right now just thinking about that one.
Yeah, I am. It blows my mind that any veterinarian still does this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think mutilating your pet is a good thing to do. Hot take, I know. Well, because even like a lot of vets stopped doing like snake devenomation. Like if
Really?
you can buy venomous snakes fairly easily, depending on where you live. Like surprisingly too easily. And
Yeah.
in the past, like even up until like the early 2000s, you could take it to a vet, they would sedate it, and they would surgically remove its venom glands. Very rarely did that actually go well, because
Why is that?
it would often just mutilate the snake. So
I mean, it just
collectively,
bums me out.
most vets stopped doing that because A, it's dangerous for the vet, and B, it's mutilating the animal. And I don't personally see how declawing cats is any different than that. But
Right.
I'm also not a
Leaving
vet, so I
open,
don't know.
yeah, leaving open the possibility for some very, very specific exceptions, like, okay, in this very specific circumstance, if the cat keeps harming itself or something, I can imagine a world where like one declawing is allowed. But just speaking very broadly in
Right?
generalities
Yeah.
here, for anybody that wants to play a technically correct card, like I'm imagining there's a circumstance in which you could say this is actually beneficial. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about just the broad, I don't want to deal with my cat, clawing at my couch or something.
Right. Exactly. So now let's finally get to nail versus claw.
Let's do it.
So the big difference is that nails generally lack the subunguous, so the softer layer of the two, and are much flatter, which you probably have noticed from looking at your own nails. Um, so technically, humans do have the subunguous. It's just very, very small. It's basically just like underneath the nail at about where the cuticle is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically it. So it doesn't grow out like the rest of your nail does. All that you have that you like see as your nail is the unguous instead, or unguous. Um, so because of that, they're just generally less supported. Even though the unguous is the harder of the two together is stronger than just the unguous. So, but what that does is that frees up the pad of your finger to be able to grab stuff, essentially. And that's why primates in general have nails. Nails aren't exclusively a primate thing, but we're the ones who sort of co-opted it the best. Even though
Yep.
there are primates with claws as well. Most of them actually have been re-evolved, from what I could find. I don't know how true that is, but that's what I seem to gather.
What
Um,
primates have claws?
so quite a lot actually. There's a handful of species of monkeys that do. Even some things like lemurs and lorises, which are relatives of lemurs. But they use them for grooming, not for like grabbing stuff. So
Grooming each other or themselves?
probably both.
Okay.
Or the very famous species of lemur, the eye, which I remember from a spooky episode of the Wild Thornberries when I was a kid.
Oh,
So it's a
shout out to
species.
the wild thornberries. Can we have
Yeah.
an episode dedicated just to them?
What a show. I loved that show so much.
Absolutely.
So yeah, there's an episode featuring an eye, which is a species of lemur that is nocturnal and uh, I think has like for like a lot of like the native cultures to Madagascar, which is where all lemurs live that aren't in zoos, um, is like sort of like a bad omen to them because superficially it is a very spooky looking animal, because its pointer finger is like spaghetti thin and super long.
Yeah, it's a weird look.
Because what and just it's just that one, and they use it to like dig out holes in trees and pluck out like grubs and stuff from inside the wood. Um, and they sort of like use it to tap and can hear sort of in the tree the grub burrows from like seeing if it's hollow or not, and then they use that to sort of pry open the bark and then like fish them out like a little hook. So that finger has a claw on the end. Um, and like I said, there are some monkeys and things that have a grooming claw, but for the most part, most primates have nails.
Hmm.
There are some others that have nails. Like I said, manatees uh, have nails. Elephants sort of do. I was not able to find a great source on elephant toes. I kept seeing things that called them hoofs, and I'm like, I don't think that's technically right.
Can we go back to manatees for a second?
Yeah.
I mean, do those serve a purpose? Do those nails serve a purpose on manatees? Famously water animals.
Yeah, mostly to itch themselves.
Oh, I don't know why I find that. I guess there are some things that are just universal, regardless of species.
Oh yeah, I mean like so Liz, my fiance, has I think she actually has footage of like a bison rubbing up on her car that was itchy. Um, yeah,
Something
or
that
rubbing up on
simple.
somebody else's car. Yeah, all animals get itchy. So
Wow. Okay.
um, and then so there's a third type of claw thing, which is called a spur. So a spur is like a keratin, basically a claw that doesn't grow from a finger.
Say that one more time. Oh, what?
It's like a spike of keratin that doesn't actually grow from one of the fingers or toes. So,
Right,
for
but what's it
example,
called?
a spur.
A spur. Okay.
So, very famously, roosters have spurs. If you get attacked by a rooster, that is what it's stabbing you with. And that's what they stab each other with. And then, also very famously, platypuses. The males have a spur on each of their hind feet that is venomous. So they grew a spur and then made it even more weird. So that is I couldn't find a ton of examples other than those two. There is one more that I'll kind of bring up in a little bit. But those are the main two that are around today that I was able to find.
Okay.
So it's technically not a claw because it doesn't grow from like a bone. There's no bone in it. It's just like a spike made out of keratin and sometimes venom.
And venom. Okay.
So with that, let's look at some neat animal claws because some of
Let's do it.
them are really interesting.
I mean, famously, podcasting is a great medium to be looking at things. So let's do
it. Okay. Well,
it.
thanks for that, Mike. So there are...
You took that harder than I thought you would.
So I'll just sort of go through this by group of animals.
Sure.
So like I said earlier, there is one species of clawed amphibian, and that is, well, I guess not species. There's one group. They're called the African clawed frogs, which I was unable to actually find if they are true claws. But
if they're not true claws, what would they be?
Not like hardened enamel, keratin around some of their toes and their hind feet, like you would think of in a normal claw, but just like thicker skin.
Okay.
Because I know spadefoot toads have that, where they just have thicker keratin in their feet to dig. These ones actually use it to tear up food. They're an aquatic frog, so they'll catch something and then like sort of kick it with their feet to tear off chunks with their feet,
Gotcha.
Which is a really strange strategy for a frog. But so because they're using them in that way, that's probably why they're called clawed frogs. Gotcha. But if you look up just clawed frogs, one that might come up, which is super cool, even though they're not technically claws, is I was unable to... I didn't write down the technical name for these frogs because their colloquial name's way cooler, and that they're called Wolverine Frogs.
Wolverine Frogs. That's a thing. Yeah. This is a real thing that exists.
So they will break bones in their fingers and pop out the bones through their skin and stab stuff with them.
Oh my god, that's hardcore.
It's super hardcore. And so frogs, amphibians in general, frogs aren't as good at it as salamanders are, but they're still pretty good, are really good at regenerating and healing stuff. So frogs won't like regrow a whole limb like a salamander can, but they heal those bones relatively quickly. So just obviously they don't want to do that, but that is something that they can do and have been documented doing like in the wild. So neat, not technically claws though. So technically Wolverine's claws are not claws.
Oh, Wolverine again, not just like Wolverine frogs.
Yeah.
I'm gonna you keep talking. I'm gonna go look up what this looks like. I need to see it now. Keep talking, Nature Boy.
Sure. So those are the only two amphibian things, at least modern. Right? It's neat, right? It's cool.
Everybody, I don't know what you're doing right now. I promise you, it's not as important as this. Like, pull over, stop, whatever it is you do. Go look up Wolverine frogs.
It's worth your time because it's super cool.
God.
And so that's pretty much it for amphibians with claw or claw-like things. So next let's talk about birds. So bird talons are claws, and they sort of do it backwards, where they use their front limbs for locomotion, their wings for locomotion.
Wings. Right.
And their hind limbs are used for manipulating things in their environment. So they do it sort of backwards compared to the rest of amnios. And so things like hawks and eagles have one claw that is much bigger than the rest. Typically that is digit 2, which would be analogous to your pointer finger. And they basically use that like you would think they would use a big claw for, to stab stuff. That's very well documented. Not so much in falcons. I don't think falcons have a big claw like that, mostly because they punch their food, which is really fun. We can have a whole episode about birds. But yeah, falcons actually punch their food. Falcons are hardcore.
They're just fighting it.
Well, they dive. So they go up really high, and they actually hunt other birds. So they'll be flying really high, and then they'll dive really fast at another bird, and then just punch it as they're, diving at like 150 miles
Will
an
that
hour.
just like knock it out of the sky and the other
Oh,
bird will just
absolutely.
fall? Okay.
hmm And falcons typically have like a not a tooth, but a second spike besides like the main like end of their beak that they
Mm-hmm.
use to like bite the back of the neck of their prey after they've knocked it unconscious and actually kill it.
Gotcha.
Falcons are hardcore. Um, Woodpeckers also have really cool feet to hang on to trees like they do. Um, they have claws that are like really sharp and really pointy to sort of get in the bark well. They also have feet that are set up really strange. So if you think of uh, like a hawk or an eagle, they have the classic, 3 toes in the front, one in the back.
Mm-hmm.
Woodpeckers take what basically would be the ring finger and they rotate that back so it's two in the front, two in the back.
Is there a particular advantage one versus the other?
It just depends on what you're using your feet for. If you're using your feet to grab fish and stuff, or mice, then the three in the front, one in the back is fine. But if you're using it to hang on the side of a wall, essentially,
Right.
you know, you want some more support on the bottom side to be able to prop yourself up more. And the claws digging into the bark helps out with that a lot.
That makes total sense.
Um, Rattites, which are your large flightless birds, things like ostriches, emus, cassowaries, and also kiwi birds are rattites as well. Um, they have big claws for kicking stuff.
Big claws for kicking stuff.
Yep. So they don't typically. I think all of them are herbivorous. Actually, I think kiwis eat insects, but they don't. You don't really need claws to. At least not how they get insects. They don't use their feet for that. Um, but like ostriches are herbivorous. Emus and cassowaries, I believe, I'm pretty sure, are herbivorous, despite the emus being incredibly violent towards humans and winning wars. Um, and so they basically use their feet for defense, but also intraspecific competition. So like males fighting each other. Uh, so they have big, sharp claws for kicking stuff and cutting stuff open like that.
Cool.
And then
Birds. Wars.
yeah, and then lastly for birds, I can't not talk about this because there's a single species of bird today that has claws on its wings.
Really?
Yes, not for its whole life, only when it's a chick. But it is a bird called the hoatzin, native to South America. And when it is a chick, before it grows its flight feathers, it has claws on its hands.
So I'm Googling this right now, and when
Mm-hmm.
you Google Hoatzin, the first result that comes up is Hoatzin claws.
Yep, because it is very famous. There's footage of chicks like climbing around, and it's like I don't like that. That's
Oh,
not a thing you should have. Um,
wow.
and because of this, it's very confusing where Hoatzins fit on the bird family tree because it's like no other bird does this. To my knowledge, they're the only like true birds that are like the overarching group of birds that we still have today that have their group is the only group that has ever had claws like that and still be like true birds.
I mean, it sounds like they might be a class of their own or something close to it.
Yeah, they're in order, all their own.
Wow.
Yeah,
I said, lowercase c class, not,
yeah.
yeah.
But yeah, um, but yeah. So if that's really cool footage to look up. That's another thing you should look up after this is a Watson chick climbing around because it's spooky. I don't like it. It's not something that should happen in nature. So that's what I'm going to talk about with modern birds. So next, moving on to reptiles besides birds. Reptiles today seem to have pretty generalist claws. I looked around and there's not too many reptiles that have really, really specialized claws. They just tend to be spikes at the end of their fingers. Some might be bigger for, fighting each other, like Komodo dragons, even for their size, have big claws. Things like iguanas have big, sharp claws for, like climbing trees and stuff. And
Right.
it's like their primary purpose is not defense. Like, if you approach an iguana, it will whip you with its tail. It won't. Yeah, so its claws are not its primary means of defense. So that's not why they have like the big claws like they do. It's mostly to climb trees.
Hmm.
Um, so even like alligators and crocodiles, they don't really have super specific claws. Um, they're all pretty generalist. But some neat examples that I wanted to point out were snakes sometimes have claws and or spurs because so your pythons and your boids, which are boas and anaconda, and big constricting snakes that are not pythons, they have the remnants of their hind legs still, and you can see them as like little nubbins, just like little claws that poke out on either side of their cloaca.
Little mini claws.
Yeah, and so that's like really good evidence. I was like, people noticing that was like, did these used to have legs when people were still figuring out evolution? Turtles are interesting because that's the easiest way to tell a male from a female, at least for pond turtles, things like red-eared sliders and such. Male turtles have much, much longer claws on their front limbs than females do.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And so presumably, I don't think I found a good reason why, but if males have it and females don't, that's typically like a sexual selection thing. Might be
Right.
males fighting each other for something, or maybe that helps them, reproduce better somehow. But that's an easy way to tell. Not with every turtle species, but with a lot of pond turtles, so you can tell that.
Right.
And then I actually have a section here for one that I actually want to talk about later, because later I have a line that says fossil time. It's not yet fossil time.
Oh boy.
Well, I guess it sort of is fossil time, because we're talking about dinosaurs now.
All right, we're doing fossil time now.
Yeah. So, well, actually, now since we're talking about reptiles, I'll do the one. Early fossil time. Early fossil time.
We're having pre-fossil time.
Yes. So there is one real weird group of reptiles. They're not lizards. You would see it and probably think it's a lizard, but they're not lizards. So they were around in the Triassic, which I don't remember exactly when this particular group was from. I think the one species that I'm thinking of was around 220 or so million years ago. But it's a group of animals called the Drapanosaurs. And they were real weird. They had one huge claw on what is their effectively their pointer finger. And by huge, I mean the size of their head.
Oh goodness!
And granted, these were not big animals. They were, they're more or less a little less than a foot long or so.
And just one claw, you said?
Yeah, just the one. Well, on each hand.
Right, one on each, but still like that. Wow.
Yeah, so depending on what species or I guess what genus you're looking up, it will vary based on what people interpret them using it for. There's one genus, Drapanosaurus, which is inferred to have been arboreal, so living in trees and using that to pry open bark to get at insects inside the tree. Other related species also had a big claw, but are not interpreted to have been arboreal. Instead, they were using that to pry open things like anthills and things like that. So, big claw used for digging into something. But also, what confused me the most when I first learned about this group is that they, for some reason, have a claw on the end of their tail. Which I guess would be
we don't know what purpose that serves.
It seems like their tail is prehensile, at least Drapanosaurus itself, which was arboreal, so having a prehensile tail with a little extra traction on the end that a claw could give would make sense. No other animal has ever done that, though, so it's like
I sort of have like a backing up question. Like, you mentioned how claws and keratin don't fossilize all that well, and we're talking about dinosaurs, which notoriously are not.
So this is not a
today.
dinosaur. This is not a dinosaur.
Oh, I thought we were doing dinosaurs.
No, I backed up. We're back to this is a lizard-like thing, but not a lizard. So not quite.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. But still a fossil nonetheless. So, it had. To be fair, we don't know what the keratin on the outside of this thing looked like. We just know that it had a bone spike that has been interpreted to have been covered in keratin.
I guess nature's weird sometimes. That's all you can say.
Yeah, and it's like I looked into it because like when I first learned about this group, I was like, that's so weird. Because it's like chameleons. Chameleons super live in trees. They're great at living in trees. They have a prehensile tail like that. They don't need a spike. Lots of geckos have So geckos are famous for having like their clingy toe pads. Some of them have that same toe pad material on their tail
Mm-hmm.
as well. And so they don't need a spike. Why did this guy need a spike like that? It's very strange. But yeah, so moving on to fossil time. It's a paleontology podcast. We're going to talk about dinosaurs for a minute.
Let's do
Contain
it. Let's do
yourself.
it.
When we talk about dinosaurs and claws, there are two big ones that you want to point out, and that would be the quote-unquote raptors, Velociraptor and such. Your Dromaeosaurs is the proper name for this group. And they famously, if you've seen Jurassic Park, have the big claw that taps on the floor ominously.
Mm-hmm.
And famously, that has been depicted as like a killing claw. They would save that and use that to go in for the killing strike. But based on pretty much everything I've seen that has been recently published, that's not really what we think they use it for anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, and it, like with all claws, it kind of depends on what exact group you're looking at. So some are thought to have used it to, hook onto bigger things as they were biting it and trying to kill it with its mouth, which was actually good for killing things. So it would basically use that as like a grappling hook.
Wow. That's just cool to think about.
Yeah. But people have done like simulations on it to see like what stress it could take from what directions and stuff. And it's like them using it as like the finishing weapon, I guess the stress that would put on it wouldn't be very good for that, or it would break if you tried to use it in that way. So that's probably, sorry to burst your bubble, but that's very famously what these have thought to have been used for. Although,
well, I mean, we already kind of broke down dinosaurs and Jurassic Park and everything, so you know what?
Yeah.
Eh.
Although there is one very famous example where it's like, it seems like that is what it was doing, because there were two dinosaurs fossilized together. A velociraptor, a true velociraptor, in a fight with, I believe, protoceratops. So something that it was presumably hunting. And there's a very famous fossil called the fighting dinosaurs, where the protoceratops had its mouth chomped right onto the forearm of the velociraptor, and the velociraptor had its big claw stuck into the neck of the protoceratops. Kind of seems like it's like, well, if you want to kill something, that's a good place to stab them.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of other things about that specimen that's like, well, maybe they might have just fallen like that and been fossilized, because it seems like they were basically buried in a big sand dune collapse. So it's like they might have just moved that way after they died. Or if the protoceratops was locked onto its forearm, the velociraptor was probably just freaking out and trying to get away any way it could, including stabbing something in the neck. Just because you did it once doesn't mean that's what it's used for. If I stab you with a pencil, that doesn't mean pencils are made for stabbing.
I have a story about one of my students.
I think you've actually told that. Maybe not in the podcast, but you've told it to me before.
I'm sure you've heard it.
But the other big group of dinosaurs that is famous for their claws is a group called the Therizinosaurs.
That's funny.
Yeah, Therizinosaurs are a group of theropods like Velociraptor. So the group that includes T-Rex, Velociraptor, and such. Typically meat-eating dinosaurs. And the largest of these, which is called Therizinosaurus, had the largest claws that we know of.
So this brings me back to that question I asked before, though. So we're talking about dinosaurs, and we're talking about claws, which you said don't fossilize all that well. So how are we determining this?
Again, that's why I said that we know of.
Okay, but how do we determine, like, just even with the claws that we are aware of? Like,
because we've found the unguals and a basically nearly complete hand, or almost a full arm of a Therizinosaurus. And oh boy, just because the ungual bone is so enormous, that's like, even without considering it being covered in keratin, it is comfortably the biggest claw.
Okay. So just based on what we do have, the bones that are aware, like, it strongly suggests a claw.
Right. And so,
okay.
So this animal was a pretty big dinosaur, not like giant, but it was around 30 feet long, around 3 tons or so. And on each hand, It had three giant claws, and just the ungual bone, the last bone in the finger. Each of them was around a foot and a half long. That single
Foot and
bone,
a half.
foot and a half. Let
Foot and a
alone
half.
how long the keratin cover on that might be. Like I said, we don't know, so it was likely longer than that.
Do we know what that was used for? Like, is that a hunting claw?
No. So they are slightly hooked at the end. They're fairly straight, and then sort of almost like a barb at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, like with the Velociraptor claws, people have done all sorts of like simulations on this to see what kind of stresses it could take and stuff. And this was absolutely not a hunting claw. Any kind of like slashing motion would probably break it.
Wow.
And also, just looking at, actually, I don't even know for sure if we have teeth of this thing, but it's pretty much presumed to be an herbivore. There are lots of theropods that went back to eating plants. Um, but it's basically thought that they use this to sit in one spot and pull leaves and branches and things toward their face. Just
Okay.
extra, instead of making your arms longer,
Just,
I just made big claws. Um,
I mean, I guess that's one way to do it.
yeah. And so obviously, I think they did some like sort of stabbing motion simulations for like the force on it as well. And it was like, they were pretty good for that, actually. Not so much like the
Mm-hmm.
slashing, but stabbing would be pretty good. Um,
Right.
plus, big claws on a big animal just makes it look bigger. And this was a feathered animal, so they had lots of feathers and things too. So it was probably also used for intimidation. Um, and with something this kind of big and crazy, there's also been the idea of like sexual selection thrown around. It's really hard to tell. To my knowledge, we don't have that many good Therizinosaurus specimens. So it could be just that all the ones with the big claws that we have are males. That, like the turtles, have big claws for a reason that helps them reproduce. Maybe the ladies like big claws on their dudes. I don't know. Um, and so that could be a thing. But again, there's not really any evidence to suggest that yet because our sample size is so small. Um, And then a quick honorable mention. There's one species that was featured in the most recent Jurassic World movie called Baryonyx. Its name literally means heavy claw. It has a pretty big claw that it was mostly an piscivorous, so eating fish. So it had a really long snout, and it would basically catch fish with its teeth and then use this big claw to like hook into them so it could like reposition them to eat them how it wanted, more or less.
Mm-hmm.
So that is all the reptiles. Let's move on to mammals. Like with
Look,
teeth, mammals really took the claws thing and kind of ran with it. Because, like I said, at least modern reptiles have pretty conservative claws. They don't really change much. Mammals are not like that.
the mammals that
Cats,
do have claws, that is.
right.
Right.
But even
Okay.
then, there are no reptiles with like nails.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
even our nails are fairly specialized. We don't consider them to be, but they are because we do a lot of things with our hands, and having big honking sharp claws in the way would get in the way of that.
Right. Okay. Let's
Um,
let's let's do mammals. You said cats first.
yeah, so cats are really cool in that. Cats very famously have retractable claws, um, which so the resting position with them sort of hidden away is the retracted position when they have them out to grab stuff. That is called protracting. And so
Mm-hmm.
when they're sitting there in like the sheath position, the ungual is folded. So like your ungual to your second phalanx connection bends toward your hand. Their resting position has it fold the other way. So the claw is like sitting next to the second bone in the finger. It like slots in, which is really cool.
Wow.
So it has like a really extremely flexible hinge. Um, and it's I'll link a Twitter GIF animation that I happened to find about how cat claws work and a little bit of like the skeletal stuff. So if you want to look that up, it's super neat. Cat claws are super cool. Um, and then dogs, just comparing cats versus dogs are fairly standard. Dogs hunt a very different way than cats do. Cats are very big grapplers. They'll run up on something and grab it with their arms and like wrestle it. Whereas dogs, they sort of just bite and hold on. If you've ever played with a dog, that's what they do when they're hunting too. So they don't
Yep.
really use their arms really to hunt like cats do. So their claws are basically just for traction.
This is for dogs just so they can like walk better.
Yeah, more or less.
Okay.
Bears. So I looked up bear claws and got nothing but pastries.
I was gonna say I thought I was blanking on exactly what it was, but I've definitely heard of bear claws before.
Yep. So I just searched bear claw, not even thinking of it because I was just doing all the looking up stuff for this episode, and it was just pastries, and I was like, oh yeah, there's that.
Whoops.
So bears have claws that are basically just giant hooks. Unlike dogs, bears don't really run. Not really. Like they can obviously, but that's not really what they're specialized for.
Right.
And unlike cats, bears don't walk on their toes like cats do. Bears walk on like their palms, very much like humans do. So they don't need to retract their claws like a cat does to keep them sharp. Because if you're walking on your palms, your claws just kind of stay a bit above the ground anyway.
Right. They're still good to go.
Right. And so they basically use them like hooks, especially like polar bears. Polar bear claws are maybe not as like big as grizzly bear claws. Grizzly bear claws are proportionally much bigger, but like polar bear claws are literally look like hooks because they basically need to not ever fail a kill. Where they live, it's like, well, if that seal slips back down its hole,
That's gonna starve.
that might be the only food I see for the next couple days. So they have these just big meat hooks that they grab stuff with, whereas polar bears or grizzly bears have much straighter and proportionally bigger claws. Moles surprisingly have really weird claws, which I guess not surprisingly because they use them to dig. That's kind of the whole thing of being a mole.
Yeah, that's one of their favorite things.
Yeah, so they're basically just these really long, almost look like pencils. Well, I was going to say spike, but like they don't really taper. It's basically just like a straight thing that comes to like a kind of a rounded point, almost like if your fingernails just extended off your hand, but came still to that rounded point. That's kind of what mole claws sort of look like.
That seems extra weird, especially because like they're using them. They should be like eroding them down. You would think that would lead to a.
You would think so. You would think so, yeah. But they don't come to as much of a point as you might think.
Huh.
And then the weirdest thing that I was like, oh yeah, I guess that counts, were hooves.
That counts as a claw?
Yeah. It's bone on the inside and then keratin. Especially,
I guess that fits the definition.
Yeah, right? Where it's like, oh, of course. But it's like, I just kind of didn't think about it because you don't think of horses having claws.
Right, exactly.
So basically the definition that I was able to find of like a hoof was a nail big enough to bear weight. And everything that I kept seeing kept specifying a nail. And I think that might just be because, like I said, calling a horse's hoof a claw is strange.
So that's more out of convenience than like scientific accuracy. That vernacular. Okay.
Right. So it's like I said, from what I could find about nails, is nail does not have a subungueus. But everything I was able to find about horse hooves is that they still do. So it's like, technically, I don't think that's a nail. But the terminology is not clear. So horse hooves seem like they're more like nails than artiodactyl hooves, things like deer or cows or bison. Those are much more like claws. If you've ever seen like a deer or a cow hoof, they are curved. They obviously don't use them the same way as like a cat or a dog might. I guess actually, yeah, they do use them kind of like a dog. They just use them for extra traction. And then the last group that I'm going to talk about as sort of a transition to fossil time for mammals is Xenoarthrins. So Xenoarthrins are the group that includes sloths, anteaters, and armadillos. pretty much every Xenoarthrin has really prominent claws. Even all the fossil ones that I was able to find, because sloths have these really big claws that they used to hang on to the trees with. Right,
Mm-hmm.
makes sense. Armadillos and anteaters have these big honking claws that they used to dig into anthills and things like that.
Yeah.
Got to get to those ants somehow, right? Um, and yeah, even the fossil ones, but especially the fossil ground sloths, which could be up to like elephant sized. Those weren't really eating ants. If you're getting that big as a mammal, on land anyway, whales eat real small stuff, but to get
Mm-hmm.
that big as a land mammal, you're not eating ants. So these guys probably did a really similar thing to those Therizinosaurs, where they would just sort of plop themselves somewhere and just long arms would reach and grab food and bring it to their face, and then they'd eat all the food that they could reach and then go plop themselves somewhere else. However, these claws also were pretty good for defense. They're much shorter than the Therizinosaurus claws, and I think hold up pretty well to stress tests for things like slashing. So very
Right.
clearly were used for defense as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then lastly, a fossil group that is fairly obscure, um, but I want to talk about anyway because I love them. So this is a group called the Calicotheres.
Calicotheres.
Yes, who my grad school advisor Darren lovingly referred to as gorilla horse bears, because looking at this animal, you would not be able to tell what that is.
I mean, is that just me or like a regular
No,
person too?
no, just a regular person as well,
All right.
because
Okay.
their closest relatives are horses. And if you were to just look at their head, you'd be like, yeah, I could see it. But looking at their body, so they took their hooves, so they still had multiple toes, unlike horses today. But they took their hooves and then turned them back into claws. And so they had clawed hind feet, really long arms with clawed front feet, but walked on their knuckles like a gorilla to keep the claws sharp. So they have the posture of a gorilla, short hind legs, long front legs, and walked on their knuckles. And
That's hard to me even. I mean, I guess I can
they're
imagine it, but it's
so
just.
weird. But it's like a horse. Like they're very strange. But similar thing to those sloths and Therizinosaurs, they would probably just plop themselves and grab some food, and plop themselves somewhere else and grab some food over there, and that's just a good general body shape to have if you're a browser, I guess. Which is weird because we don't currently really have anything that shaped today. Gorillas are the closest thing.
I was gonna
Just
say, there's nothing that immediately comes to mind that kind of fills that niche.
Yeah, pretty much just gorillas. And even then, they're pretty localized to a couple places in the
Right.
world. But yeah, that's a body plan that is like consistently kind of shown up over and over again with pretty beefy claws to back it up. So that pretty much brings us to a close here. I wish that I was able to bring more into the evolution side of this, but there was surprisingly little.
I mean, you brought in Wolverine Frogs, and I think that was. I mean, that was good enough for me. Just that right there. No, but this is really interesting, especially just kind of the difference between a nail versus a claw, and then thinking of hooves as really just being differently shaped claws. At the end of the day, this was a cool episode to have and just be able to think about.
Yeah, one that hopefully wasn't too technical. Um,
Yeah, I think
but
this was very well done.
why, thank you.
So this has been episode 60 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin, and we will see you all next week. Take care, everybody.